We're very pleased today to have Danny Bassett joining us from the University of Pennsylvania. Danny did her training in physics, starting at Penn State, then PhD at the University of Cambridge, did a postdoc down at the University of California, Santa Barbara, has won a list of awards, too long to mention all the expected kind of young investigator awards from the funding agencies, as well as Sloan and MacArthur fellowships and whatnot. You can go look up the impressive list on her website if you want to. Someone that I've admired for a long time in her work bringing the mathematical and engineering tools of network science together into neuroscience. So really excited to hear what she has to tell us today about networks thinking themselves. Danny, welcome. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So I'm supposed to hold this here for the audio recording that you won't hear. So I'm going to very awkwardly stand here talking to the microphone for the next couple minutes. So the topic of my talk will be networks thinking themselves. And what I'm going to try to do today is to give you a pretty broad picture of 3 different arms of research in my lab that are interdigitated in what I think is an interesting way, and I'm going to try to convince you of that as well. But before I do that, I want to start with a really very broad question to get us situated in the high dimensional space I'm thinking about, and ask the question, what is knowledge? And obviously from this set of pictures that I've placed here, you have an indication of maybe what I think knowledge is, but when you hear the term knowledge, you might have something quite different in mind. But I think something that might be common across all of our definitions of knowledge is actually very well articulated in this quote from John Dewey in his Democracy and Education, where he says, "Knowledge is a perception of those connections of an object which determine its applicability in a given situation. Thus, we get at a new event indirectly, instead of immediately, by invention, ingenuity, resourcefulness, and ideally perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that any past experience would offer a point of advantage from which to get at the problem presented in a new experience." There are many points about this passage that I like, but the point I want you to focus on specifically is the fact that he immediately calls out that knowledge is composed of many connections. And in fact, an ideally perfect knowledge would represent such a network of interconnections that you can actually make new decisions based on that knowledge. So an open question that we ask in my lab is, how is it that we gain this knowledge network? And I think intuitively, if you're just sort of sitting over coffee or over beer later in the evening, you might think of 2 ways in which humans gain knowledge networks. The first one is obviously just by curiosity. You're curious about something, you go seek information, and then you find it and you add that to your knowledge network. And again, Dewey agrees with that. He says, curiosity is not an accidental, isolated possession. It is a necessary consequence of the fact that an experience is a moving, changing thing involving all kinds of connections with other things. Curiosity is but the tendency to make these conditions perceptible. But curiosity and sort of self-motivated information seeking is not necessarily the only way in which we gain a network of knowledge. Another way that we gain a network of knowledge is actually by example. And in order to illustrate that for you, I'm going to give you an example. So this is a passage that's actually from Robert Macfarlane's book called Landmarks, where he talks about one of his mentors that really was very meaningful in his life. The mentor's name is Roger Deakin, who was an English writer and documentary maker on waterways. And he invites Roger to the University of Cambridge, which is where he is currently studying, to give a talk to all of the faculty at Cambridge. And he's very much hoping that his mentor shows them sort of the stuff that he values and believes that this person represents. But unfortunately, what actually happens is this. And so this is what Robert Macfarlane says as he's listening to this talk from Roger Deakin, his mentor. "I stared dedicatedly at my shoes, embarrassed that my friend was failing to perform in front of my academic peers. It was only later that I realized it wasn't a failure to perform, but a refusal to conform. Cambridge seminars expect rigor and logic from their speakers, a braced subtlety of exposition and explanation, tested proofs of cause and consequence. But water, which was Roger's subject, doesn't do rigor in that sense, and neither did Roger, though his writing was often magnificently precise in his poetry. For Roger, water flowed fast and wildly through culture. It was protean, it was slip shape, and so that was how he followed it in his lecture. ship shape, slipshod and ship shape at once, moving from a word here to an idea there, pursuing water's influence too fast for his notes or his audience to keep up with, joining his watery subjects by an invisible network of tunnels and drains. And so what Robert is actually indicating here is that Roger's lecture showed by its actual architecture, or the flow of thoughts in the lecture, it showed the actual topological signatures of the content that he was actually trying to describe, so waterways itself. The way that he walked through those ideas is the same way in which water passes through the UK landscape. And so this idea indicates to us that he's showing by example the content, the architecture of the content that he has in mind. So that obviously makes me think, well, let's think about lectures in general as a walk through a network. And maybe the lecture architecture differs depending on what you're studying or what you're talking about. So UK waterways may have this sort of much more fluid shape to them with many holes and sort of large tortuous curvatures. A lecture on linear algebra, this is obviously a generalization, but perhaps is a little bit more structured than a lecture on UK waterways. And finally, lectures in history, let's focus up here at the top left, perhaps they have more linear structures to them because you follow history as you walk through time and try to explain and understand why something that happened previously guides what happens next in a more linear form, right? So this motivates the question, is there an optimal way of walking through a network in lectures or in books or in the papers or grant proposals that each of you is writing yesterday, today, tomorrow? Okay, so that sounds a little bit abstract, but I want to make it more concrete. So let's focus on this specific question. Let's imagine that I'm standing in front of a class of undergraduates at Penn, and I'm teaching a set of topics. Let's say there are 15 ideas that I want to translate, and those 15 ideas are related to one another in a pretty heterogeneous way, like this, okay? So here are my 15 ideas, and I'd like to translate that picture to undergraduates in my lecture. I have to translate this object linearly because time is one-dimensional and unidirectional. So big question is, how do I take this potentially high-dimensional object, map it into the one dimension of time so that the people on the other side can optimally reconstruct what that network actually was? To make that a little bit more concrete again, let's imagine that this is the brain of the speaker or writer. So this is you. You have your ideas that you want to translate. You have to map them into the one dimension of time because you can only pass through one concept at a time, whether you're speaking or writing, right? In any of our communication that we often use. And you want to do that in such a way that the person, the listener or the reader of your ideas can optimally reconstruct what that potentially high-dimensional object was. So an interesting question is, what is a good walk through this network? One potential definition is that it minimizes the reconstruction error or maximizes the perception of the accurate perception of the initial network topology. Okay, so let's build a behavioral experiment where we can test this kind of learning and this type of reconstruction and mapping in humans, right? So what we're going to do, here's our network. Here are the individual nodes and the edges inside of the network. What I'm going to say is that each node in this network is a specific stimuli. And that stimuli could be a word, an image, or a movement. And then every edge inside of this graph indicates an allowable transition between nodes, an allowable temporal transition. I'm allowed to go from number 9 to number 10, but I'm not allowed to go from number 9 to number 4. Okay, because there's no direct edge between them. All right? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct a sequence of stimuli by taking a random walk on this graph, only obeying the edges that actually exist, not traversing any edges that don't exist. So it's just a stream of stimuli like this. And then in order for me to understand how humans are responding and get an indication of whether they're capturing and understanding the network architecture, I have a particular task that they have to perform on either each stimuli or a certain set of those stimuli. So they're going to perform a task, and then their time to react to that task will be a measure of how well that edge in the graph was learned. So here's a very simple example of how to put that into a laboratory experiment with humans. Imagine that I have, and this is what we actually have, here's a human hand on a laptop keyboard. Here's a stream of stimuli, and those stimuli are taken as a walk on a graph. The actual graph that we're using is this same graph here. And the stimuli here has 5 buttons or 5 boxes that indicate which one to press. So this says press the 5th button. Next, press the 1st and 3rd button, press 3 and 4, press 5, press 2, right? And this stream of commands is drawn from a random walk on the graph, where every node in the graph is a movement. All right, so what do people actually do? Here is the reaction time of human participants as they are asked to perform this probabilistic sequential motor learning task. What you see is, on average, a fairly swift reaction time to nodes in the graph that are inside one of these clusters, and a striking slowing of the reaction time on edges that cross the boundaries between 2 clusters. Okay? Yes, Ilya.
Numbers are 1 second, 1.25 seconds. What is the error bars? Just so that I know what striking means.
That's a good question. Probably, I want to say it's about 10%.
10% of the difference or 10% of 1 second?
So about 10% of 1 second. I think I have a figure later that I'll show you that will give you an indication of that. But what I want you to notice is the slowing, but I also want you to notice why it's surprising, because it might initially seem as if that's maybe not surprising. The reason that it is actually quite surprising is that this is a very particular kind of graph. So if anybody thinks a lot about graphs, you might notice that this is a K4 regular graph, right? So every node inside of this graph has exactly 4 connections. So you can look at here, it has 3 connections internal, 1 external. Any of these have exactly 4 connections coming out of them, which means, if I'm taking a random walk on the graph, that every edge is traversed an equivalent number of times in the limit as time goes to infinity, and the transition probability on any one of those edges is 25%, right? I'm sitting at a node, and I have a 25% chance of going here, 25% chance of going here, here, or here. So what's very surprising about this is that people are slowing here when they shouldn't necessarily, if they were accurately predicting the probability with which they would see that edge occurring. So this striking slowing occurs at the cluster boundaries, indicating to us that what they are perceiving is not necessarily the local connectivity, but this gross structure, the fact that there are 3 different clusters in here, and then they are interconnected by these cross-cluster edges. Now, since we actually showed this particular effect where you have very swift responses inside of one of these clusters and slower responses between the clusters, we've also asked the question of, well, what if we had shown that same sort of information but on a different graph architecture? And is it possible that some graph architectures are more learnable than others, and whereby learnable, I mean that they will induce a swifter reaction time, or people will show a swifter reaction time to those graphs. So we explicitly compared what happens when we study a modular graph versus when we show a random walk on a lattice-like graph like this. And what we see on average is that the reaction time to the modular graph is significantly lower than the reaction time on the lattice graph, even if the stimuli or the commands are exactly the same. So what that suggests is that the graph topology perhaps is important in learnability of an architecture. Now, you're probably wondering, what is it that individuals or humans are thinking? That's certainly something that I've been wondering. And why would it be that we would see this slowing at the cluster boundaries, even though the transition probabilities are exactly the same? They're all this 25% chance of occurring. And I think what is happening, and this is our hypothesis, is that they are building expectations about the network structure by remembering what just happened to create some sort of expectation of the transitions that they're likely to see, right? So let's make that a little bit more specific. Here is a person in the experiment. This is at time t plus 1, and then this is the stimuli that they saw at time t, right? So in order for them to build an expectation of transitions, they have to always remember two things. One is what is happening right now, or they have to realize what's happening right now and remember what happened just before. So we could say that their probability of recalling x at t minus delta t is perhaps non-zero instead of actually remembering what exactly happened at xt. So in other words, if they don't have a perfect memory or have been distracted by something that they have been thinking about, they might not remember exactly what happened just before, but what happened 2 before, or 3 before, or 4 before, or 5 before. Depends how long potentially they were distracted or how poor the focus is. Now, so what we can do, and I put the link down here, this is a preprint that is on arXiv if you're curious to work through the actual theory behind it, but I'm just going to give you the high-level version of it now for purposes of time. But what we do is that we call on the free energy principle to suggest that the brain minimizes the errors in the predictions, but also the computational resources that are required to make the predictions. And that balance gives us a very simple Boltzmann distribution with an inverse temperature parameter beta here. And I'm going to show you exactly what that gives us in terms of their predictions of the graph architecture. So here's the person again. And what you see is the probability of remembering what happened just before now. If your inverse temperature parameter beta goes to 0, then you have an equal probability of remembering anything that happened in the experiment up till this point. Okay? So this means that what you're building in your expectation of the graph is a fully connected network. You anticipate that any of these transitions are possible, right? And equally possible. Okay? All right, that's what happens if you have no memory, and that obviously minimizes mental resources, right? You don't have to remember anything for that prediction. On the other hand, if you have a perfect memory, your beta goes to infinity, and that gives you a delta function right here at 0. What you have is a perfectly accurate prediction of what will happen, what just happened, and then you build a perfectly accurate prediction of what the network architecture actually is. And that's this here, which is the exact graph that we had shown the human participants. But we actually don't see very many people who have either this effect or this effect. What we actually see is something much more like this. So when beta is close to 1, you have a high probability of remembering what just happened, but you have a non-zero chance of remembering what has happened previously, and that probability of remembering something in the past sort of decreases with the age of the information. All right, so something that happened at the very beginning of the experiment, you're unlikely to say is predictive of what just happened. Okay? And what happens then if you have this beta go around 1 is that this is the expectation that you have in your head. So you have a high expectation of following along these edges that had occurred recently in time. And you have a decreased expectation of these edges, which occur more intermixed at longer time intervals in the experiment. Right? And this prediction is exactly consistent with the reaction time difference that we see in the humans, the actual human participants. So that suggests to us that they are potentially building a prediction in their head of what the architecture actually is, and that it depends on the topological distances inside of the graph. Now, if that's true, yes?
So what you're talking about here is effectively is coarse graining time.
Yeah, exactly.
So they could also in principle be coarse graining space, right? And just knowing exactly the time, but not knowing, like, I don't quite know where I am, rather than I don't know where I am at this particular time, right? So is there a way, a killer experiment to distinguish whether experiment distinguish?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know what space means in this case because it's just a single stimulus that's 5 buttons and you're pressing that what it says, right? And then as soon as you do that, there's another stimulus and then another. So this two-dimensional representation.
Cluster buttons, right?
What?
I can cluster buttons in my mind. So say I don't know what I pressed could be A or B, right? Rather than I pressed A at a certain time.
Well, there's nothing spatial about the stimuli, though. So I don't know. Or is your question really about space versus time, or is it, did you remember what just happened, or can you perceive what's in front of you right now? Because those are slightly different.
No, what I'm saying is I people effectively misremembering time when things happen, right? Or are they misremembering or not quite seeing what exactly is happening right now in front of you? They know the time exactly, but they don't quite know whether it's letter A that I pressed or the letter B, right?
Yeah.
One of those. Right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's an exact, I'll have to think about whether there's a good experiment to probe those two. I think because the stimulus is right in front of them, it's unlikely that they're not perceiving it, but I'm making that as an assumption. And I think it's more likely that they're forgetting what just happened, but again, that is an assumption. So I think that it would be interesting to think about tasks that would help us to distinguish that. Yeah.
Clarify the meaning of a given edge. So I noticed that in all of these graphs that the degree is decreasing as the memory is increasing, but based on I think your prior definition of the edge as being the ability to connect a node to a given node based on some heuristic, that's a relatively like subjective measure. So how are you objectively defining the order of a given node?
Yeah, so the actual graph that we showed people, so that where the stimuli were drawn as a random walk on this graph, but this picture I'm showing you is basically the predicted transition probability that we think the human has in their mind. So that's not what we showed them. There's actually a disconnect between what we showed them and what their behavior seems to indicate to us that they're perceiving.
So technically speaking, the edges in those graphs are not traversable.
No, these ones are just predicted. This is sort of the picture in their head. If
So
you,
these are undirected, correct?
That's right. Yep. But it does make, I think that's an important point, and it suggests if this is a picture that they have in their head of their anticipation of what is coming next inside of the stream of stimuli, then we can make a prediction in a new experimental context. So specifically what we did is that we now showed a separate set of individuals a ring graph like this. Well, we didn't show them the graph. We showed them a stream of stimuli and commands from that ring graph. And then we asked the question, if every few stimuli we threw in a violation of that graph, are people surprised? Because if they are, then that indicates to us that they have an implicit perception of what this is, even if they can't tell us with words that this is what they are perceiving. So we threw in 2 kinds of violations. So a violation that's only 1 hop distance away, 2 hop distances away. 1 hop distance is a no violation. 2 hop distances is definitely a violation. So there's no connection from the white node to the blue one. Or we could have a violation which is the white one to the red one, right? And so that should be particularly surprising. So our prediction was that they would definitely be surprised, indicated by a slowing reaction time, if we show them white to blue, and that they would be even more surprised, meaning even slower reaction time, if we showed them white to red. So here on the y-axis is their change in reaction time. If we show them a short violation versus no violation, I want you to notice that this is greater than 0 significantly, so that indicates to us that yes, they slowed down when they saw an edge that was a violation. And then here is a long violation versus no violation, again, significantly greater than 0. And then this is long versus short. And so again, you can see that this is greater than 0, meaning that they slow down even more when you violate their expectations by a longer hop on the graph that was not expected. So this indicates to us that this architecture of the stimuli, even though they're just seeing a stream of stimuli, they are able to perceive, they show by their reaction times that they have some understanding that this is a ring structure that gets violated. All right, so humans are surprised by stimuli far away on the ring rather than closer, indicating their implicit perception of the network topology. So that has led us to a couple questions that we're trying to tackle in the next couple months/years, as these things go. Number one is when we employ these processes of graph learning, not just in the motor context, we also have some data in the visual context, and we're moving into concepts and words now. The interesting question is, as we learn these graphs in the world around us, do we end up ever forming gaps inside of the knowledge spaces? And if we do, what do we do with those knowledge gaps? We have a paper that just came out this year by Anne Sizemore in the group, in case you're curious about what these knowledge gaps look like and how frequently they occur and why. We've also been asking the question, what is the optimally learnable graph? I told you that a modular graph tends to lead to swifter reaction times than this lattice-like graph. But the question is that, those are just two potential architectures. The possibilities for the number of architectures of this size and of larger sizes is massive. Is there a way for us to identify what the optimally learnable graph is, and then potentially, this is down the road, use that architecture to inform the way that we present concepts in a classroom setting, for example. Okay? And then lastly, do different humans prefer to learn information on different graph architectures? Do some individuals prefer information presented on modular structures, and some individuals prefer information presented in a different organization? All right, and what would that mean? So this potential dependence of graph learnability on the specific human that is learning makes me think of this passage from Alexander Pope, where he says, "There's some peculiar in each leaf and grain, some unmarked fiber, or some varying vein. Shall only man be taken in the gross? Grant but as many sorts of mind as moss." Which is a sort of motivation of the fact that we can't actually treat every mind as the same. Every mind is actually different, and an important question for us to ask is, how are those differences reflected in the behavior, but also where do they draw from in terms of the neurobiology of the brain? So much of our work over the last few years has been focused on that question. What is it about a specific brain and how it learns that allows for a particular feature of behavior? And specifically in the context of learning graphs, we're very interested in the question of what features of the brain might support the learning of graphs themselves, either in words, in images, or in movements. And then might differences in those features explain differences in the ability to learn. So very early on in the lab, and actually even before the lab existed, we went back to the drawing board and asked the question of, is there some feature of architecture inside of a human brain that should make it most adaptable and most ready to learn in a variety of different contexts? And as we were thinking about it, we thought, well, there's clearly a very common refrain in the literature, in evolution, in development, in biology more generally, and in neuroscience specifically, that modularity of an organ or a system is something that allows for adaptation of that system over both short and long time scales. So that's true in terms of the structure and morphology, for example, of the beaks of Darwin finches, but it's also a concept that we can actually quantify in the organization of the human brain, and we can do that in a quantitative way using tools from network science to identify modular architecture. So we started by asking two pretty simple questions. Are brain networks actually modular, number one? And then number two, does modularity help us to understand large-scale signatures of adaptation and learning at this very, very large sort of system scale? The way that we have answered or tried to begin answering that question is to start with neuroimaging. Much of our work has been focused on using fMRI data, although we also use ECOG data and EEG and MEG as well. I'll actually show a little bit of ECOG data later in the talk. But let's imagine that we start with some neuroimaging measurement. And then we have the human brain. We parcellate it usually into between 200 and 1,000 different anatomically defined units. And then we measure, using this imaging technique, the regional activity time series from that area. then what we do is that we ask whether two regions of the brain show a similar pattern of activity as a potential indication of interaction or shared response to an external stimuli, or potentially communication. Not all of those things are necessarily true for every measurement of functional connectivity. What I'm showing you right here is just an example, which is based on a wavelet coherence, and this is using a parcellation of the brain into 112 different brain regions. What this indicates to you is the strength of the wavelet coherence between region I and region J in a given parcellation of the brain, and using the time series from a given type of measurement. So this is the sort of approach that we use to ask the question of whether the brain shows modularity. And not just my lab, but many other labs across the country and in fact the world have shown over the last couple of years that there's very strong modular organization inside of the networks constructed in this way. So here what you see on the right-hand side is the brain, both the lateral surfaces of the human brain and the medial surfaces of the human brain. And then on the left what you see is regions of the brain as circles, and then connections between regions of the brain indicate a particularly strong level of this measurement of functional connectivity. This picture, we have actually thresholded the matrix. The matrix itself has non-zero values in every element. We've thresholded it for simplicity of visualization. But in all of the analysis that I'm going to show you, we use the fully connected weighted graph, not a binarized version of it. So this is just for ease of visualization here. I want you to also notice that the color coding is consistent across these two. So for example, these blue regions here are all in visual cortex, and they're relatively spatially localized. But I also want you to notice that there are regions of the brain that tend to form these network modules that are not spatially localized. So notice this red one here is composed of regions in posterior parietal cortex, in superior frontal cortex, and also regions in the midline as well. So very, very spatially distributed. So there's not necessarily a simple rule that if you're spatially close to another brain region, you will have strong functional connections with them. So yes, the answer to our first question is yes, absolutely the system shows modularity. But then the next question is, does that modularity matter for adaptation and for learning in this particular system? So because this signature is so strong and so consistently observed across laboratories, across different humans, and across even different clinical populations and ages, we decided to focus on what is it about this architecture that might change as a function of time and behavior. So what we did is that we actually use for the people who are really interested in the computational aspect, we use what's called a multi-layer modularity maximization approach, which is a community detection method that's developed for networks, and specifically for networks that evolve in time. So what you do is that you take each of the adjacency matrices, which gives you the pattern of functional connectivity in the brain at a given time window, and you connect it up with all future adjacency matrices in this big multi-layer network format, and then you apply a really nice algorithm to identify where the modules are and how they change as a function of time in this multi-layer system. What we find is that is pictorially shown at the top here. Just to simplify again the visualization, what you see is that the modules of the brain stay consistent throughout time roughly, but what changes actually is the intersection or the interactions between different modules. And one feature of these experiments that I particularly want you to focus on is shown up here in the very top node in this graph. So notice this one node right here. It has strong connections to the peach module initially, but then over time it grows stronger and stronger connections to the yellow module, and eventually has only very weak or zero connections to the peach module. So this is an indication of a change in the allegiance of a region to functional modules in the brain. What that means is that the activity profile of that region has changed significantly over the course of the experiment. So maybe initially it showed similar patterns of responses to the other regions in this speech module, but by the end of the experiment, it shows similar responses to the task as what is shown by the other yellow regions. Okay? This actually happens very frequently in all of the learning experiments that we have studied. And it also seems to happen particularly frequently in regions of the brain in frontal cortex and in parietal cortex. And what we have actually seen over the last couple of years is that that flexibility, particularly in frontal and parietal cortex, is predictive of individual differences, so across human differences in visual motor learning, in cognitive flexibility, in working memory performance, particularly a 2-back. The cognitive flexibility was measured by a Trails B score for those for which that makes sense. And then it's also predictive of learning rate. We've shown just this past year that we can also predict future learning based on this notion of sort of flexible modules. And I'm going to show you just one slide from that study to make these ideas a little bit more concrete. So what we predicted by the earlier studies, that if you have relatively flexible boundaries between modules, then you're able to adapt and learn more swiftly, would suggest that brains that have very, very strong connections between modules are potentially more constrained dynamically, whereas those that have relatively weak connections between modules are those that can display more flexible dynamics over the course of a learning experiment. So to test that prediction, what we said is, let's take 5 minutes of spontaneous, or if you're an animal person, spontaneous activity, if you're a human person, resting state scan. Let's take 5 minutes of that intrinsic activity before a person has ever started learning the task. And let's ask whether from the modular structure of that spontaneous recording, we can predict how much they will learn in the future. And this is a discrete sequence production task, so it's a motor learning task that they learned over 6 weeks of practice. So here's data from 5 minutes before they started a 6-week regime of training. All right? And we asked this question. For people who have the more strongly connected modules, we anticipate that they would show weaker learning, and for individuals who have more of this structure, we would anticipate better learning. So here's the learning rate over 6 weeks of practice. This is the exponential drop-off in movement time, so that's the time it takes them to perform these sequences, these motor sequences. And here is the connectivity between the visual and motor cortex. And what you see is that stronger connectivity is related to weaker learning, and lower connectivity is related to higher learning. And again, this is 5 minutes of resting state before they started practicing. So that suggests to us that this notion of modularity is not only present in humans, and not only does flexibility in that modular structure during learning help us to understand behavior, but actually you can use that same theory to predict behavior in the future to some degree. Obviously, there's still a lot of scatter here, so there's more to do, but we're excited about the potential here. Now, I want to ask the question of whether or not that flexibility can be pushed around. If it's useful for learning, and if it's correlated with working memory performance and cognitive flexibility, is it something we could move? Is it something that we could potentially enhance? Could we intervene in individuals who have just had a stroke and enhance flexibility at this scale to encourage rehabilitation more swiftly, for example? Obviously, there's a lot. Those are very, very hard questions to ask, but they're open questions that we are excited to ask. The 2 studies that we have performed to ask the question of could you move this around a little bit are shown here. On the left-hand side, we show whole brain flexibility of individuals who are either taking a placebo or taking dextromethorphan, which is a bit of a muddy drug, but it is known to at least shows some amount of efficacy in being an NMDA receptor antagonist, suggesting that it alters the excitatory-inhibitory balance in the brain. And what you can see is that on DXM, the flexibility of the whole brain system is increased in these healthy subjects, 41 healthy subjects. And this is data from this Braun paper in 2016. It's in collaboration with Andreas Meyer-Lindenberg and Heike Toast at the Central Institute of Mental Health in Mannheim, Germany. The other piece of data that we have is from the Bassett 2016 paper, and that is shown on the right-hand side, where we actually see that daily variations in brain flexibility are correlated with positive affect. So the more positive affect on a given day within a single subject, the higher the brain flexibility. It's also modulated by fatigue and by arousal. So that suggests to us, this is a correlative effect, but it suggests to us that possibly there could be interventions that alter these points that would then causally alter the brain flexibility. That's not something we've proven with this data, but it is a correlative effect that motivates a intervention study to potentially push the flexibility around. All right, but before we get too excited about pushing flexibility higher and higher and higher, I wanted to show you this fact, which suggests to me that actually the relationship between higher order cognitive function, specifically in the sense of cognitive flexibility, working memory, and learning rate on several different tasks, is an inverted U-shaped curve. This is hypothesized, right? This is clearly just drawn by me. So the data sets that we have so far and that we've published indicate that flexibility is certainly increasing in development between the ages of 8 and 22. It's also increasing with positive mood, and we can definitely push it up by DXM. All right, and definitely in the healthy individuals and in the kids as well, what we see is that higher flexibility is correlated with better cognitive performance, particularly on these sort of higher order tasks. But I also wanted to mention that over here we've been studying individuals who have schizophrenia and also relatives of people with schizophrenia. And what we see is that individuals with schizophrenia have higher flexibility than healthy controls. We also know that people with schizophrenia have decreased executive function, cognitive control, working memory, performance, and many other things, but specifically those. So that suggests to us potentially that we're dealing with something like this, which is an inverted U-shaped curve. And what we're hoping to do in the next couple months/years is to fill out this whole curve so that we can really understand what is it about flexibility and up to what point is it useful, and then how is it altered and how is it comprised in people with schizophrenia that differs and that may actually be harmful for cognitive function. So that's sort of open questions there. All right, so I wanted to leave you with one last idea. I want you to notice really quickly that both brains and these easily learnable networks that I talked to you about have modular structure, and that's pretty curious to me. I'm curious about whether the architecture of an optimally learnable network is a topological reflection of the optimally developed neural network. And is it important, or is that just sort of happenstance? Could it tell us something about computation in the brain? I don't know, but I think these are questions that potentially are worth asking. And that reminds me of this piece from Aristotle, which motivated the title of the talk today, where he says, mind thinks itself because it shares the nature of the object of thought, for it becomes an object of thought in coming into contact with and thinking about its objects, so that mind and object of thought are the same thing. Now, obviously, what Aristotle had in mind when he thinks about what mind does when it interacts with objects or stimuli in front of it is potentially quite different than what we as neuroscientists think about what mind does when it has objects or stimuli in front of it. But if we were to ask the question of what does becoming really mean to a neuroscientist, so what does the mind do when it has an object of thought in front of it, I think we have to go a little bit further than these studies that I've shown you before and really have a better understanding of what happens when the mind contemplates something. But even to answer that question, we have to go back even farther and ask the much more basic question of how brains respond dynamically to any external stimuli, and how might this reconfiguration of the functional networks that I've just been talking about be driven? Is there a perturbative signal that's responsible, and how is it propagated? And that set of questions has motivated for us a whole arm of research where we're focusing on trying to understand when a region is stimulated or when it becomes particularly active, how does that activity flow through the rest of the network? And does the network architecture constrain the flow of that activity? So in other words, what we're trying to do is to understand what is it about the structure of large-scale connections in the form of white matter tracks in a human brain mean for how activity in response to stimuli can flow through the system and change the functional network organization. So if these regions become active, where I'm showing these arrows, how does that change the amplitude of not just those regions, but everything else that they are interconnected with? And can we understand something about the constraints that this architecture imposes on these dynamics? Okay? So we've been formalizing those questions in the context of network control theory. And this is in order to think about network control, you have to stipulate not only what the network is, which in this case is the structural wires, the white matter tracks connecting different parts of the brain, but you also have to specify what a model of dynamics, because that's what's going to tell you how the activity flows through the system, right? Now, when you're talking about dynamics in a brain, there are many wonderful models of dynamics. I'm going to start with the very simplest model that you could possibly think of, I think. If you have a simpler model, please let me know. But I think that this is probably the simplest one that we could imagine. And that is where we have the state of the brain at time t+1 being equal to your structural connectivity. This is a weighted adjacency matrix that's directly drawn from the pattern of white matter in the human brain, times the state of the brain at time t, and then plus some control. So here's your control energy injected at time t, and that's being injected into kappa regions. Now, so this is a linear, discrete time and time invariant model. It's also noise-free, so I'm just going to put that out there too. So this is a relatively simple model. What we would like to do is to understand, in this very simple model, can we say something meaningful about the constraints that this piece imposes on the kinds of dynamics that we will observe? We can do that in two ways. We can study the actual controllability Gramian of the system, and we can extract several different statistics that allow us to quantify whether the impulse response of the system, and that's measured by this notion of average controllability, or we can quantify notions of how you can push the system into very distant states on the energy landscape versus nearby on the energy landscape. I'm just going to go through this quickly because of time. You can also ask the question of, if you know where the brain is right now and you want to push it to a very specific next state, we write down this cost function to say, let's identify where we should be injecting energy to push the brain from this state to that state. And what does that mean? And can we see evidence for that kind of model in human brain dynamics as well? So those are the tools that we are using. But the data that we've initially acquired is to use the model to try to understand cognition and development, and then to extend that into exogenous stimulation. In cognition and development, we've shown over the last couple years that different brain regions have more or less power to alter whole brain dynamics. And in fact, the regions that are very well able to push the system to distant states are those that are important for executive function and cognitive control. We've also shown that the capacity for brain regions to change dynamics grow as children develop. This is a study where we have 882 children from the ages of 8 to 22, and we show increases in these two types of controllability. We also show that individual differences, so where they are from this average line, is correlated with their performance on cognitive tasks that demand executive function and cognitive control, suggesting that these network models, simply based on the underlying white matter architecture, can tell you about how possible, or how the prevalence, the ease with which control can be exerted intrinsically in this system. So together, these results suggest that this fairly simple theory is a useful marker of how the brain enacts control to change network function. And the very last piece of data I wanted to show you is pushing this into exogenous stimulation. Can we use this simple model based on the structural connectivity to understand what happens when we stimulate a brain region? How far does that structure go in telling you what will happen after you stimulate a region of the brain. So for this, we're using electrocorticography data from patients that have medically refractory epilepsy. And we have patients who have volunteered to be part of a stimulation regimen where different regions of the brain, or different electrodes, are stimulated. And we want to understand whether that pushes the brain into a state that is better for memory encoding specifically or not. And what we actually see is that when we stimulate a region that has high modal controllability, which is this statistic from the underlying structural network, we see a change in the memory encoding state probability of the system. And this is a positive relationship suggesting that when you stimulate regions that have this underlying structural architecture, it pushes the brain potentially into states that are better for memory encoding. So that has motivated many open questions, and that's just on arXiv, so you can, it's in review right now. But the open questions are, how much energy is required for a state transition from one brain state to another? Does that change over development? Does it help us to understand the human's capacity for task switching? Number two, over what timescales or frequency bands is the theory most valid? And that's work from Jenny Stizo in the lab. And then number three, by building this sort of first principles theory, can we use network control to better optimize therapeutic inventions such as stimulation, but potentially also task-based interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy, or potentially medication for neurological disease or psychiatric disorders? And those are all very open questions, and I think interesting directions for future work. So those are three different stories that I told you that I'm hoping actually over the next couple of years to bring together. So can we understand optimal learnability of graphs and understand what is it about the brain dynamics that allows for that optimal graph learning to happen? What are the structural underpinnings that support those dynamics and that could potentially impinge on the learnability of graphs themselves? So this is where the lab is going over the next few years. And here's another pictorial sort of summary of what we did. So we started with John Dewey motivating the question of knowledge as networks. We talked a lot about knowledge network learning, and then we crossed over the cross-cluster edge of Alexander Pope into brain network dynamics. Then we went across Aristotle into brain network control. So these are three very different arms. As I said, we're hoping to interdigitate them even more in the next couple of years, but I'd be very happy to take questions on any of those, and of course to acknowledge the people who are in my lab right now, but a lot of the work was done by people who have just recently left. So I wanted to make sure that I put their faces and names up here as well, and obviously the funding agencies that have supported the work. And with that, thanks, and I would love to take questions.
It seemed that weak connections were good for flexibility, but could they also just be unreliable? Say, I don't know whether beginning Alzheimer's, would they have more rigid connections or just fluttering connections? And would that be good for learning or bad?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the question was, is the flexibility just driven by weak, noisy connections or weak in some important way, right? And what I think is happening is that the flexibility measure that we have is a quantification of how many times brain regions move between modules over the course of the experiment. Now, if you have a brain region that's moving between two modules, let's say motor and visual cortex, and it's just sort of bouncing back and forth in its pattern of functional connectivity, that could mean that it's actually sharing information between the two, and that might be important functionally. However, if you have a brain region that has high levels of flexibility, but because it's showing some connectivity, weak connectivity to 10 other different modules, I would say that's more noisy. So I think, in fact, when I showed you that inverted U-shaped curve between cognitive function and flexibility that I'm hypothesizing is there, I actually think that these high levels of flexibility that we see in the schizophrenics are not the same kind of flexibility that we see in healthy controls. I think that they are more of this sort of random associations of regions to other modules that are driven by transient fluctuations that are not useful for transporting information. Alzheimer's disease I can't necessarily comment on because I don't have any data on that, but it would be interesting to check. I don't know. Yeah, in the back. We haven't yet. But again, I think that would be really interesting. Right, so this very sort of simplistic notion might be that they have more rigid architectures, and that would be interesting to see if that's true. Yeah, we haven't, yeah.
So I was really intrigued in the first part of your talking about learning on graphs and the concept of thinking about creating educational platforms that are built on sort of optimized around the graph learning. I'm curious if, what do you think about child entering life, what they experience? Has anyone really ever studied sort of the patterns of the way that things are sort of common across different, probably all parents in the world present things to their children. I wonder if there's sort of a natural structure to that, and then also how those graphs grow as the sort of world of a child grows.
Yeah. So those are great questions. I think that one way that you can tackle them is by, there's a lot of data that's available for child-directed speech, but also speech of the parent with the child. And so you could certainly take it into the linguistic domain and say, what is a co-occurrence of words that the parent uses? Does that have a certain architecture that then is eventually reflected in the child's speech as well? I think that would be interesting. In terms of how it grows as a function of time, the one way that we're trying to tackle that now is actually not in young children, but in sort of college age. We're asking the question of how these concept graphs change over the course of a semester. And then we're also looking at textbooks that are accompanying that class, and when are concepts introduced and what is the co-occurrence of concepts in the textbook. So very early on in the textbook, which concepts are introduced first and in what co-occurrence being at the sentence level, and then how does that change as a function of time in the textbook? And can we see that progression also in the way that students map the relationships between concepts on paper? So we give them these massive pieces of paper that are sort of 8 times the size of a normal page, and then we give them the 50 concepts that are most germane to that class, and we ask them to map out where those concepts would go. Concepts should be close together if they are related and far apart if they are not related, and then they draw the connections that they understand between those concepts on that piece of paper as well. And we do that multiple times throughout the course of the semester, so we can see it change. Then we can ask how that change tracks with or doesn't track with the changes in the co-occurrence of those same concepts in the textbook. So that's one way that we can tackle that, but I think there's a lot of open space there. In the back and then over here.
I'm wondering whether the scale of the network, or how important the scale of the network matters. And specifically, I'm thinking, if I'm within a specific domain, does the flexibility within a module also matter for that domain? So is the flexibility within a visual module important for a visual learning task, so on and so forth? Or is this really kind of only on this kind of whole systems?
I think actually both are true. So the question is flexibility important in a task-specific versus task-general way? So if you have a visual task, is flexibility in the visual cortex important more so than other areas? I think probably certainly it's known that there are regions of the brain, mostly in frontal parietal cortex, that are important for task switching just in general. And so I think that flexibility there is going to be important in a task general way. I think that's the hypothesis. But I also think that there will be an amount of flexibility inside of a given module that's important for the task that may also be relevant. So I think if I was to guess, my answer would be both are important, but I don't have enough data from enough different tasks to really answer that empirically yet. Yeah.
First of all, thanks for your talk. This isn't my field
Sure.
at all, but I felt like it was able to follow along. So
Great.
credit to you. You spoke earlier about how we might be able to design the graph learning paradigm to match with the networks that are existing in the brain to facilitate learning.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering how those develop in the first place, but not from a development
Yeah.
perspective, but maybe a genetic or evolutionary. So I was wondering if there's an evolutionary or maybe even a comparative approach to how this modularity emerges.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I think that there's definitely the preferences for how we see information, I think this actually gets to Garrett's question too. The question about how we see information and what our preferences in terms of its architecture, I think certainly probably has to do with the architecture of the world around us. And that if the architecture of the world around us has certain structure, then we will prefer to see information in that way. But our preference is that just because we've seen that from development or has changes in the brain over evolutionary timescales also made us prefer that, because the world hasn't necessarily changed that much. I don't know. And I don't even know how to start answering that question empirically. I don't know. It's sort of a philosophical. There are genetic markers for modularity. We're working on that paper right now. There are, yes. Sure. Yeah, in the back.
Actually, I can almost build off of that question, which is, you looked at individual differences. Do you know how much of that individual difference might be explainable by genetic factors? Or if you looked at twin studies or individuals in each family, are there any similarities in the network architecture?
There is a really nice heritability study from Sophie Franjo at Mount Sinai that is on heritability of the network control part, so that structural bit at the end definitely has a strong genetic underpinning. We haven't done, I don't know of any papers that have assessed that for the functional flexibility that I showed. So I don't know the answer to that question.
I think why don't we take the rest of the discussion
Yep.
outside the reception. Thank you.
Thank you.